Hello and welcome to the Argument and Theory podcast, a podcast dedicated to argumentation theory and the study of humanities in general. Today I have on Professor of Philosophy Scott Aikin at Vanderbilt University, joining us from Nashville, Tennessee. Dr. Aikin specializes in epistemology, ancient philosophy, and pragmatism. Join us today while we introduce argumentation theory and touch on topics in informal logic and fallacy theory. You can contact Dr. Aikin through his email at scott.f.aikin@vanderbilt.edu. Thank you for being with me, Dr. Aikin. I'm really excited. Okay.
Happy to be here.
Okay. So I wanted to start by just introducing argumentation theory, especially since this is the first podcast. So can you describe what it means to study argumentation to a non-expert? And can you tell us what kind of insights can be learned from theorizing about argumentation?
So argumentation, let's pay attention to that word and the fact that it has an ending on it. That indicates that we're looking at a process. We're looking at exchanges of reasons between people. Arguments themselves are, in some ways, abstract objects. They're things that are relations between propositions that can have probabilistic or deductive relations. Whereas argumentation is something that's not just a set of relations between propositions and pieces of information. They're events that transpire between people, and that we're looking not only at what kinds of pieces of information are going to be able to support other pieces of information, but what kinds of pieces of information are going to answer a question, or going to be able to handle an objection, or to be able to resolve a disagreement so that we can then get on with our lives. Argumentation, then, is about a kind of process of reason exchange between people. And so when we, as logicians, we're interested in what kinds of arguments are going to be good. But we also, as logicians, need to be interested in what kinds of arguments are going to answer kinds of questions or answer a kind of objection, help us get on with things. And in that regard, a lot of the ways that we've set up the evaluation of argument, in terms of just looking at them as abstract objects and just relations between pieces of information, leaves out a lot of the things that we do whenever we have arguments with people. And argumentation theory is, in some ways, the making of relevant the processes that we use to be able to resolve our disagreements or to shore up our agreements and to make sure that we're right.
Yeah. So you really highlight that argumentation is a social process. In your book, Why We Argue, you and co-author Robert Talisse claim that argumentation as a practice is essential to our contemporary world because of our mutual interdependence. You guys state that our beliefs are our beliefs are dependent on information provided by others. We depend upon others to be honest, precise, careful, and accurate. Then you go on to say the health of our cognitive lives depends in large part on the health of the cognitive lives of others. Can you tell us about our mutual political and epistemic interdependence and what role argumentation has to maintaining proper cognitive health?
So one of the things to start with is to acknowledge the fact that we, as individual knowers and inquirers, wouldn't know much if it was just up to us to be able to gather the information about all the things that we need to know. We are cognitively dependent beings. We're dependent beings in all sorts of other ways. We're like, I couldn't have my coffee. I didn't build this building. I didn't make this computer. We're dependent upon each other for many of the features of our material lives. We're dependent on each other for many features of our cognitive lives too. And the fact is that you do your thinking from the inside, but much of the information with which you think, and in fact, many of the skills with which you think, are skills that you have acquired and depend on others to be able to A, make sure that they're right and make sure that they're good, and B, make sure that you continue to use them. And so one of the funny features about being around other people is that you pick up many habits from them. You probably have seen this from micro habits of just the ways that people will express themselves. You know that people have been hanging around with each other because of the fact that they speak in ways that are similar. Certain lilts of voice or turns of phrase, or even the way that they hold their bodies start mimicking each other. We're really good mimics. We have a lot of mirror neurons that sync us up together and that we signal that we're synced up. The reality is that our reasoning and our beliefs work that way and they work on us. And so in order for us to have accurate beliefs and in order for us to be responsible, is not just an on your own practice. It's a practice that in some ways that we have to start regularly reflect upon and insert ourselves into our regular practices. And so in the same way that you can develop the habit of saying whenever you talk to somebody who says the hope here is that we can develop the habit of reflecting, hey, is that right? Or what was the source on that? Or are we just kidding ourselves? Those kinds of questions and the habits of asking those, we can pick up and distribute also.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it sounds like you're saying it's important for us to cultivate like proper argumentative and I guess epistemic virtues because we all depend on one another.
Yep.
So we talked about the role argumentation plays in our interpersonal lives, but we didn't fully define. Well, actually, you did talk about a bit earlier about what an argument is. Um, you referenced that we're logicians. So a lot of philosophers, in my experience, try to reduce the study of argumentation just to formal logic. I'm just wondering if you've experienced any of this tendency in philosophy departments,
Yeah.
and I'm
Oh,
wondering.
absolutely.
Okay, good.
Yeah. I mean, so there were two things to be said. One is a philosophical thing. One is the sociology of the profession. Um, the philosophical thing is that it's clear that ways that we think about errors in logic, and some of the most clear errors are ones are that depend on the fact that we insert questioners and people with critical issues. The simple fact is that arguments and the argument evaluation cannot be strictly a formal issue, is because circular arguments that with premises that themselves are also the conclusions of the arguments, will be valid. Why? Because validity is a requirement of arguments that if the premises are true, it guarantees that the conclusions are true. If the premises are the conclusions are also some of the premises, it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. Consequently, all circular arguments by formal requirements will be valid. That's a disappointing result if you think that all argumentation is reducible to formal logic. What we need is the concept of making progress in our reasoning. And the only way to do that is to insert minds with questions, minds that don't have yet the answers but need to think them through, minds with objections. That's what reasoning does, is traverses and makes a little progress there. And so the only way to get that concept of progress is to insert a mind that doesn't have it all. Insert a mind that's got a question. Insert a mind that's got an objection. Insert a mind that in some ways is just making sure. And in this regard, we have to have people in there in order for us to be able to say circular reasoning is bad reasoning. Why? Because the mind is not making progress. Formal logic doesn't evaluate that. Formal logic is, again, just about the strict information. That's the philosophical insight about argumentation, that we need minds and their questions about themselves and their questions about their information and their limitedness and in some ways the friction that happens between them for the magic of the exchange of reasons to actually make sense to us and for the badness of begging the question to actually make sense. The
Yeah.
sociological feature about the
Okay.
nature of the discipline of philosophy is one that I think emerges because of a kind of history that the discipline has in the ancient world and has inherited because of its aspirations to be more like a science. And it's the following: mathematics is the model for knowledge. Now, if we think that mathematics is, you might say, the sort of the height and the perfect model for what knowledge looks like, then formal logic is going to be, you might say, the philosopher's analogy to that. The philosophers are going to say, look, if it's just mathematics, there are no people in math. There's just numbers and their relations and topologies and so on. The same thing goes with formal logic, that these are formal relations. You might say they're propositions that are true by virtue of their form. In some of these cases, the reduction of mathematics to logic, that program, there are no people in there. And so the model, the sociological story of philosophy is this story of taking mathematics as a kind of model for what knowledge looks like. And then logic, the logic that maps that is going to be the logic that's going to be worth understanding. But a reality is that much of our knowledge is poking about, wrangling, figuring things out for ourselves, and sometimes figuring out with each other, and answering questions. And it's because of all of that non-formal stuff that happens between finite minds with incomplete information that we arrive at knowledge. That is what we've studied with informal logic. That's what we study with argumentation theory. All of the messiness that happens with all the human minds and the fallible knowledge that emerges whenever we do it right. The reality then is that the sociology of the profession then has got a kind of model for what philosophy and what the core features of logic are supposed to be, that it needs to look like mathematics and this pure model for what knowledge is, and that it's impossible for you to be wrong. But that, I think, is just an error that the profession made a long time ago, and that continues to be inherited by lots of folks taught how logic works in the profession, that informal logic is just a list of fallacies, and then you move on. That's, I think, a pernicious attitude that too many philosophers have got about informal logic and argumentation theory. It's a kind of prejudice that's been inherited because I think of a past that the discipline has had that we've inherited from Plato and Aristotle. I don't blame Plato and Aristotle. Knowledge is that knowledge is awesome. That knowledge is great, and we should aspire to have that kind of knowledge. But that's not the only model for what we need. And so whenever we study argumentation theory, we're studying all the messy stuff that actually happens between ourselves. And importantly, holding even philosophy to the standards of mathematical and formal logical structures is, I think, inappropriate. Much of what we do whenever we argue in philosophy is we say things like, hey, that begs the question, or hey, that's a false dilemma. Again, false dilemmas, they're valid. Dilemmas are valid if you just negate one of them.
Yeah.
False dilemmas are valid. All of these, many of these cases actually require that we insert people with questions, that we insert the messiness of us having incomplete information. And the only way for us to be able to kind of even really, I think, even conceive what we're doing as philosophers is to insert us as philosophers into philosophy and even the argumentation that we're doing between each other to be able to represent it. Philosophy that doesn't have argumentation theory at its core is going to be incomplete. Now, again, that's a lot of very, self-satisfied back-patting that I'm doing here and saying, hey, I got the true metaphilosophy here, folks. But the reality is that if the philosophical point that I made about the poverty of the poverty of formal logic, to be able to capture many of the goods that we want to achieve and many of the bads that we want to avoid, the reality is that informal logic and argumentation theory have answers to that unfortunately too many philosophers have ignored.
Yeah, I really liked both of those points. The sociological point I thought was pretty interesting too. If you look at writers like Descartes and Spinoza, I feel like that is super evident. Um,
Perfect. And the
on
irony about Spinoza is that actually the really interesting things don't happen in between the propositions, but happen in the scholia.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where things get informal. He's like, hey, you may have a question. You're like, look at you.
Right. Okay. So while philosophers tend to reduce argumentation to logic, teachers of argument in English departments, on the other hand, are actually really hesitant to teach any formal logic in the composition classroom. So, for example, Richard Fulkerson states, quote, neither Aristotle's categorical logic nor Frege's predicate logic are ever seen outside the pages of logic textbooks, math books, and a few books on computer programming, so they need not concern us here. He adds that English teachers need to understand that syllogistic reasoning should not repeat, not, sorry, yeah, English teachers need to understand syllogistic reasoning, but should not repeat, not bring syllogisms and their attendant terms into the writing classroom. Doing so isn't helpful. It is likely to be confusing and it takes up a good deal of time. He goes on to say one gains virtually nothing by distinguishing inductive and deductive arguments. So, um, I just wanted to briefly touch upon um, what kinds of goods do you think formal logic brings to the study of argumentation theory?
Well, first off, the irony is that much of our I don't know, I can't remember the name of the person that you just quoted. That person's reasoning looked like it was pretty deductive.
That's what I was thinking.
There's something weirdly self-refuting about that. There are no instances. Oh my goodness! If there are no instances, then what? But again, there was one qualification that was part of what he had said, which is that you don't need all of the formal stuff to be able to understand syllogisms. And it's there that I agree but disagree. And here's an important fact about logic. Logic, especially formal logic, but informal logic too, is doing two things. And in both cases, it's slowing us down. It's saying, look, logic can't teach you to be a sort of a decent boots on the ground, like, hey, if you can't tell the difference between modus ponens and or hey, if P then Q, P, right? Versus some other terrible bit of reasoning. Hey, it P only if Q, Q, that doesn't work, right? And so if you can't already kind of see those differences, logic is not going to be able to help you a long way. In some ways, logic rides piggyback to a lot of the natural capacities that we have as reasoners. Now, if our friend in the English department here has said, look, I don't need logic to be able to understand syllogisms, the first answer is, you're right. That's correct. You should, as a speaker of a natural language, be able to see many, many valid syllogisms. Moreover, as a speaker of a natural language, you should be able to distinguish between fallacious reasoning and non-fallacious reasoning. You may not have those, you may not have the vocabulary. You may not be able to say, that is a post hoc propter hoc fallacy. A little bit of Latin for you there. You don't have that, but people can nevertheless tell the difference because like I tell so many jokes in these logic classes before I even introduce the fallacies and they get them, right? Hey, this rock keeps away tigers. I've never been attacked by a tiger since I've been holding this rock. Right? They get that, right? They get that that's silly, right? That's post hoc propter hoc, right? And so the fact that we naturally can be able to get these things is not a reason why we shouldn't be interested in A, how they work, and B, how they work systematically. Because that's what these disciplines are about. They're saying, because if the point is that, like, I don't need a logic class to be able to get a syllogism, the answer is, well, in some ways, you do need a logic to understand why the syllogism is good. If someone just says something like, hey, P, if P then Q, P so Q, and they're like, what makes that a good piece of reasoning? You just have to, like, do you say it again? Do you say it louder? Do you say it like they're stupid? Hey, if P, then Q, P, so Q, right? Like, it's unclear what more you say if someone's not following. What logic is that says all of these things that seem like they are obvious, all of these things that they seem like common sense, all of these things that seem like it's that if you have to ask, you'll never know questions, actually are things that we can crack open and analyze and be able to explain and actually really understand. You were just in some ways doing this by kind of robotic rote memory before following these syllogisms. What logic does is it takes these little micro skills that you've already got, cracks them open, and says, hey, look at this micro skill. It's actually connected up, and what makes this a good skill is actually connected up with this good skill. Hey, if P then Q, and P, so Q. That's actually connected up with, hey, if A, or B, not A, so B. Those are actually connected up and connected up in a systematic way. And we can string all of those things together to actually be able to compute things. And this is the last part, to compute things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to compute if we didn't understand them individually. We master the obvious so that we can master what's not obvious in logic. We master what and means and what all means and what some means and what or means. We all of that shit's obvious and it should fucking be. But the reason why we master it, the reason why we do the deep dive on it is so that A, we actually really fucking understand it instead of cultivate incuriousness with regards to things that you just think are obvious. The second reason why we do it is that once we actually understand it, it becomes something systematic that can carry us beyond something that was already something that we could compute without it. We create systems so that we can actually compute information beyond what we could normally do. And once you're trained to be able to do it, you can see it and you can show it. The last part of this is that it actually makes you a better writer. It's not true that not knowing propositional logic doesn't make you a better writer. Do you know why? I'm a better writer because I know propositional logic. I'm a clearer reasoner and I understand my reasoning and I can criticize other people's reasoning because of the fact that I know that logic. And I can detect it and I can separate the premises from conclusions and I can see those patterns and explain those patterns and also detect and explain whenever that's not working. Consequently, I think that that's just ridiculous that this person says that we don't need that. We may not, this person may not understand or be interested in that logic, and that is fine. You don't have to be interested in that logic. But saying that it doesn't help is not true. Saying it doesn't help is, and saying that it's not worthwhile is not true.
Hmm. Yeah, on that last point, I definitely agree. I think when rhetoric and philosophy diverged a long, long time ago, they took to different paths. And a lot of English teachers, even as Fulkerson notes, they have other things to worry about and they don't really get to studying logic, which is fine.
That's fine.
But I think uh
And by the way, lots of logically good reasoning is not very convincing. They're out for something else.
right.
They're out for something else. They're out to do something else. And that's fine in some ways.
Um, I definitely agree. I'm happy you said that learning propositional logic made you a better writer. That's something I've told so many people before, and I've never heard somebody else say that back. So I think
Absolutely.
that's cool.
Absolutely. Because first off, just the process. So learning propositional logic, being able to represent all that stuff. First off, the information that's in your head has actually got a form and you can put it down. You can put it out and you can see it. Just mastering your own thoughts, the kind of clarity, the kind of explicitness, the kind of self-understanding that comes from just seeing the form that your thoughts take. That's an amazing experience that's worthwhile in and of itself. But the second part of it is that in doing a proof, in working your way through a complex piece of information, you become good at explaining your reasoning. Again, whenever you're writing, you don't say modus ponens, lines 3 and 17. You don't do that. But you will say, hey, remember, right? Hey, remember from before we committed to these things? See how they give us this? Now see where we can go from there? That's actually good writing. And good writing is downstream from the good reasoning. And being in the habit of one, regimenting where you're reasoning from and where you're reasoning to. And then second, thinking things through in the right order. That's what a proof is. That actually makes you a good writer because then it makes it so that your reasoning is followable.
Mhm. Something you touched upon earlier is you said that real life arguments are messy. I'm gonna now to add that, they often involve unstated assumptions, implicit claims. So, notable argumentation scholar Franz van Emeren says that the goal of informal logic is to interpret and evaluate real life arguments. So, being the resident informal logician, uh, on this podcast, I was wondering if you'd be able to differentiate what it means to interpret an argument charitably and uncharitably, and then once we get our interpretation, What kinds of tools does informal logic give us?
Well, I guess the one of the important things about charitable interpretation is identifying what is reasonably within bounds for attributing to your interlocutor. Because on the far end of the bound of reasonable interpretation is interpreting the people with whom you are reasoning as reasoning from very implausible commitments and using bad reasoning forms or bad reasoning heuristics to be able to get to their conclusion. That, you might say, is the sort of the picture of what straw man criticism of one's interlocutors ultimately is an uncharitable representation of what their reasoning is. One of the first things to actually start with is the fact that whenever we reason with each other, we're not just reasoning about the thing on which we have a question. We are often reasoning about each other's reasoning. We have to not just represent the question, we have to represent each other's reasons about the question. So one of the first conditions for us to be able to resolve a disagreement or to answer a question, if the objective is a kind of a pragmatic one, or even a rhetorically robust one, to be able to get assent, and for that assent to be stable, for it to be reliable, for it to be something that withstands a lot of other kinds of questions that could come up after you've stopped talking, is for you to make sure that you're actually addressing the reasons they've got. Think about how futile it would be for you to criticize reasons that someone with whom you disagree don't have. It boggles the mind that people do that, but nevertheless they do. Questions as to why people strawman is an entirely separate question. But the whole reason as to why we need to be charitable and what it is to be charitable is to try to address the reasons that you think are going to be the best ones. Now, again, we're all going to have like an opportunity for there to be a slippage between their actual reasons and what you think are their best reasons. Hold that in abeyance for just a second. And to say, look, in order for you to actually resolve the disagreement, criticizing the worst reasons on the issue is not going to be something that's going to yield either a resolution, or if it does, it's not going to be a very stable one. Criticizing and eliminating reasons that you think are bad ones, that nevertheless are, you might say, the best of the bad, are going to be the ones that are actually going to yield the most stable resolutions. And again, that's the point of the argument, that we want to be able to, that we want to get back on with our lives. Argument is a costly thing. It's emotionally costly. It's time costly. It's cognitively costly. It is a costly exercise. Let's do it right when we do it. And part of the reason why we want to do it right is so that we don't have to do it again. If we regularly come back around and find that the reasons that on the basis of which we resolved this were terrible reasons, one of the lessons that we should be taking away from it is like, let's try to address the best reasons, right? Let's try to address the best reasons. The last part of this is, why are people uncharitable with each other? Mm-hmm. And one reason, I think, is that they are interpreting the situation as one that is either they don't have to convince the other person, they just need to convince other people who are watching this. So what's most often the case is that whenever you see uncharitable representations of another person's reasoning, it's not for them. It's not for the person with whom you're disagreeing. It's for the people who are watching, who are generally on your side. And so the straw man phenomenon, representing another person's reasoning and their views in the worst light that you can, is clearly not going to affect them. It's not going to convince them. They're going to be like, I know what I said. That's not what I said. But the people with whom you already agree, or the people who are on the fence, it miseducates them. And I mean, I presume that you've had this experience. You've met someone who you just fucking hate. Yeah. You just don't like them. And so no matter what they say, you're just like, no, not having it. Nah, right? I'm going to just disagree with you because I just don't like you. You've had this experience. I've had this experience. Everyone's had this experience. The reality is that what straw manning takes advantage of is the fact that you've already got a lot of folks who are already have already got a lot of antipathy, either cognitively or emotive antipathy towards some folks, and a misrepresentation of them is exactly what they want. Straw manning gives your audience what they want, which is that the opposition is wrong. Whenever it's done to your face, it's often done for another reason. So that's whenever you're not on screen or whenever you're not there. Sometimes straw manning's just not for the target. But whenever it is given to you, what that actually is trying to do is chase you out of the situation, chase you out of the exchange. Uncharitable interpretations are really ways of just chasing people out of the exchanges, saying, I'm going to interpret what you said in a way that's dumb. Now you've got two things you have to do. Now you have to correct the record, and then you have to give your argument again. And so notice that what that does is, again, it doesn't show them that they're wrong. It just shows them that the cost of the exchange just went up. And given the fact that argument is already plenty costly, it's costly time-wise, emotionally, in terms of cognitive stuff, you got to keep track of things, you got to keep track of their reasons, you got to keep track of stuff that you said, and now they're saying that you said something different and something dumber, and now that hurts your feelings, and now the costs just went up. What are they doing? They're chasing you out. They're chasing you out and making it harder for you to do the job. And sometimes it's just wiser to just be like, fuck it, I'll give it to you. I'm out.
Mm-hmm.
I'm out. Thanks.
Yeah, I think um something you highlighted there is that both parties, when you argue, need to have a certain level of agreement. And if somebody's going to be straw manning you to your face, you don't share a kind of agreement you want in that kind of argumentation. So, yeah.
Yeah, and
Um,
sometimes the straw man is just a marker that you're just not understanding each other. And
mhm,
so you just say, look, we need to let me educate you about my view,
yeah.
right? If this is what you think the view is, then maybe I get to talk for a while.
Mhm. Yeah. So you and John Casey um introduced three variations of strawman. Strawman, weak man, hollow man. And you say all of which have the potential to be non-fallacious. So I was wondering if you could just talk about why what in what ways strawman arguments could be not fallacious, which I think is what you were just touching upon there.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So one way that straw manning can be non-fallacious. So the overwhelming consensus in argumentation theory is that straw manning is always fallacious. So the first thought here is that this is a lot of what I've said so far is relatively non-controversial, or at the very least, if it's a little bit controversial, but it's, again, I've been trying to say things that are just not my own view. Now this is my own view.
Okay.
Which is that there are non-fallacious versions of the straw man fallacy. And so again, we'll just take the sort of the classic, the representational straw man, where you represent your opponents as having a worse view than they actually do. One version of it is that you might say is a case where what you're doing is that you're actually teeing up your interlocutor to say something deeper. And so a regular phenomenon, this happens in informal conversation pretty regularly, where what you'll do is that someone will say, well, I confronted him. You say, you confronted him like really viciously? Or you say something like, oh, we had a disagreement. It's like, were you yelling? Right? What you're doing is that and then you give them an occasion, right? So there can be cases where you interpret them as saying something more radical than what they might have said. And that what you're doing is you're actually giving them an occasion to refine their view. Notice, by the way, that that's not a case where it's like, that in order for the straw man to be vicious and in order for it to be fallacious, it requires not just a misrepresentation of their view, and even not just a misrepresentation of their view as a worse version. It's a misrepresentation of their view as a worse version and then a closing of the argument. You don't have anything to say back because your view is so stupid. What the non-fallacious versions of the straw man do is that they say, hey, there's an interpretation of your view that's not quite so good. What do you have to say to that? And notice that in some ways is a pro-social version of the straw man. It's one that says, I now come to you with an interpretation of your view that's not so great and casts it in not so great light, but I do so in anticipation of you clarifying your view for me and in clarifying your view for us. And so what's important to distinguish between the fallacious and the non-fallacious versions of the straw man, it does not reside in the misrepresentation or the sort of the over-representation or even in the interpretive features of the view. It has to do with the purpose to which it's put, which is what makes fallacious straw man fallacious is not the misrepresentation. Again, I told you it was going to be controversial.
Yeah.
It's not the misrepresentation. What makes it fallacious, again, what makes it a straw man is the misrepresentation. What makes it fallacious is not the misrepresentation. It's the closing effect, saying, you don't have anything to say back about that. Whereas the one that says, hey, here's an interpretation of your view that's not so great. Have at it, right? That's actually one that moves the conversation along, that allows a level of clarity, and moreover is one that doesn't. Because notice, by the way, that there's one other feature of the straw man that's very irregularly talked about, which is that it also has an ad hominem element to it.
Mhm.
That straw manning an opponent represents not just their reasons, but them as reasoners. And what will often be the case will be that if you present the straw man that says, here's a dumb version of your view, and so we're done here because you're dumb, versus here's a dumb version of your view, please clarify, right? Those are two different kinds of expectations, and those are two different kinds of representations of your interlocutor.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think pointing that out shows that misrepresentations, how you use it, can have different like dialectical functions. You can, like you said, yeah, you can close the conversation down, or you can pose maybe, yeah, uncharitable representations to help the conversation further along. So something you touched upon very briefly earlier that I thought was subtle that I'd like to get back to is the role of disagreement and agreement in argumentation. So the subtitle to um, your book, co-authored with Robert Talisse, is A Guide to Political Disagreement in an Age of Unreason. I wanted to ask you what role both disagreement and agreement play in argumentation.
Um, Not hard to see why disagreement's in there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the role that argumentation plays is a kind of sorting your true beliefs and false beliefs role that's supposed to be public, that's supposed to be manifest, that we can all get on board, that we can resolve our disagreement, get on with our lives, get on with our shared lives together. So the disagreement edge of argumentation, I think, is again not criticizing your question, but to say that that's the place where we normally start. And one edge of that is agreement is the goal. However, we need to argue when we agree too, and we need to argue well when we agree. Because when we already agree, we suffer from different kinds of errors that we'd suffer from when we disagree. When we disagree, the person we're arguing with, we're more tempted to interpret them as saying something bad. Our critical standards go up. We're more inclined to will be more inclined to really tightly scrutinize the things that they say and maybe shift the burden of proof on them in different ways. But when we give reasons with people with whom we agree, it's actually very different. There's what's called the belief bias, and it's a very simple phenomenon, which is that when you think that the conclusion of an argument is true, your likelihood of being able to detect bad forms of reasoning drops precipitously. If you think, and again, I'm going to say it again, when you think that the conclusion of an argument is true, your capacity to think critically about it, the bottom falls out. Consequently, it is super important that we develop certain kinds of argumentative habits, not just to resolve disagreements. We need that. But we also need certain kinds of argument habits to be able to maintain healthy agreement. Because given the fact that if you already agree with people and they show up with terrible reasons, but the conclusions are things that you like, you are more likely than not to say that that was a good reason. That yields all sorts of terrible pushings around of your beliefs. Moreover, a misrepresentation of the quality of the reasons for those beliefs. And so a terrible, terrible phenomenon, this phenomenon of belief polarization, is not because of the fact that we pay attention to people with whom we disagree. It's actually because of the fact that we talk to people with whom we agree. Belief polarization is a phenomenon that supervenes on agreeing groups. It's the people with whom you agree that radicalize you. It's the people with whom you agree that makes it so that you are further off from the people with whom you disagree. The problem of agreement and being able to manage agreements with people is a unique and different kind of problem that, in fact, I think that is the biggest problem for us. If you think that polarization is the problem, then the only way to address it is not to think about like ways that we can talk to each other when we disagree. Again, I think that that's important. But in order to arrest the polarization and in order to undo the effects on us, we have to be able to think about ways that we handle agreement.
Hmm. Yeah, I really liked that article, Argumentation, the Problem of Agreement. Um, so you touched a lot upon when we share agreement and we have some disagreement, but I also think it'd be interesting to discuss what happens when there is virtually no agreement at all. Um, so let's see. Yeah, when two parties share no common ground. So can you explain to us what deep disagreement is? And can you tell us the difference between optimism versus pessimism concerning deep disagreement?
Right. Um, so one of the things that was in the background for charitable interpretations of each other's arguments is that in some ways you need to be able to identify the quality of the reasons that people are giving. In order for you to give a charitable interpretation, you have to say, okay, I think I see what you're doing here. Here's how it looks right to me. Here's how it looks. Here's the good version of your view. And that requires that in some ways, in order for you to say, here's the good version of the view and be like, and for them to say, yes, that's good, you have to agree on a lot of other background stuff. You have to agree on certain kinds of intellectual principles about reasoning. Maybe you have to agree about a lot of things about how the world works and things that are true about the world. There's just a lot of background stuff that has to be in some ways coordinated between two people in order for you to interpret each other's arguments in ways that you can both say, that's the good version of my argument. Okay. So if that's the case, then background agreement is a condition for quality reason exchange. Now, the reality is that given the phenomenon of polarization, it's not just one or two beliefs that get polarized, but in some ways, belief clusters pull apart and become more radicalized. And if that's the case, then there becomes progressively less and less in the overlap between two belief systems that you can draw on to be able to identify reason quality. Consequently, the further apart two belief systems get, the harder it is to be able to identify even any shared reason quality. So, a normal disagreement is a case where it's like, yeah, we share plenty of background commitments about how the world works and about principles about reasoning and other jazz. And this is a kind of local as opposed to global problem. And we can sort of rally our shared resources to be able to put an argument and a bit of reasoning together to resolve it. In a deep disagreement, you don't have those shared resources to draw upon. You might have enough. Maybe you both speak English, right? Or maybe you both think that like having more money than less is better. But there's not a lot of other stuff that you might share in common in terms of what the money's worth or what the money's good for or what even better means. And so in those kind of cases, it's very difficult to A, imagine how to identify even what their reasons are, and B, how your reasons are going to have any traction with them if they have the same problem. And so deep disagreement has got, in some ways, really kind of two faces. One of them is an interpretive phase, which is the further apart two belief systems get, the harder it is to interpret their reasons as reasons. Consequently, the harder it is to even see it as a disagreement and more just somebody with noise. And that's a bad result if we're in a democracy, or if we're doing our best. I have philosophical commitments outside the argumentation theory stuff. I'm a kind of deontologist, someone who thinks that people have got intrinsic rights to dignity and things like that. And I think that the more inclined that as we start getting to a point where it becomes hard for us to see a disagreement as a disagreement and another person just making noise, that's me failing to respect their intrinsic dignity. And that's a problem. That is a moral failure on my part. If we've got a conflict and I don't even see it as a disagreement, you are not none of this is a product of reason. It's just you making noise that I don't like. That's a very different thing from a disagreement that can be resolved rationally. And so again, I have other background philosophical commitments, which is that like we have a duty to recognize each other's intrinsic dignity, and deep disagreement is a kind of problem that we have with each other that makes it so that it's an impediment, not just to us resolving the disagreement, it's an impediment to us even seeing each other as worthy of arguing with. And that's a problem, because the second that we start thinking of other human beings as being unworthy of addressing with reasons is whenever we start becoming the kind of monsters that we're worried about.
I really like that last point. I I feel like it gave like vocabulary to like an idea I had that I was not able to express, which is like if you ever engage into some kind of argument with somebody and they're not, I guess, engaging in the argument virtuously with you, they're not respecting you or something, it feels the same way as if somebody committed like a moral error against you, which makes sense
Correct.
because according to your view, it just is a moral error.
Yes, according to me, it is. And again, that's a little bit more of a controversial philosophical thesis. This is connected with what's called the ethics of belief, which
Mhm.
is because we need to respect ourselves and each other as creatures of rational dignity. We owe it to ourselves and each other to resolve our disagreements with reasons. And that means that we need to be able to do it in ways that are procedurally appropriate. And so this is the reason why democracy and those procedures in democracy are the way they work. It's like, yeah, we're all political equals, right? We may not be equals in lots of other things, but we're all political equals. Nobody's rights trump anybody else's rights. And so that's the reason why we argue it out. That's the reason why everyone gets a vote and all that other jazz. That notion of equality is again a kind of a rational version. The argumentation stuff is exactly the same thought, which is that not arguing with me in good faith is a failure to treat me as a creature of rational dignity. And you can feel it whenever it's done to you, and you're like, that's a real bad. But the temptation to do that to others, the temptation to treat them, people with whom you really disagree, and you think that they just make noise, the temptation to do that is way too great. And I think that on way too many sides of our political debates, on way too many sides of our philosophical debates, on way too many sides of our personal just disagreements with each other, the contempt that we are so comfortable expressing toward each other makes us worse.
Mhm. Yeah, something you referenced earlier that I think um connects well with this is you said that argumentation is very costly too. I'm wondering, I don't, I believe it's David Kaplan who wrote The Myth of the Rational Voter. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
Not familiar with it.
Okay, yeah. Um, okay, we can get to that another time. Okay, another question I had. You specialize, okay, so outside of argumentation theory, you specialize in epistemology, ancient philosophy. and your undergrad was in classics. And I was just curious because um my undergrad was in English and philosophy. So I have similar, thank you, similar experience. I wonder if you've read, I guess in the classics department, if they were highlighted any or which of the figures that are popular in like ancient argumentation theories. So like probably I would say almost I'm gonna have to say probably Aristotle, but I'm wondering were the sophists like Gorgias or Protagoras were they talked about? And I'm also wondering about Cicero and Quintilian, like Roman orders.
Um, so the divide between philosophy and rhetoric is a deep and wide one. Um, the classics department, we studied the rhetoricians. Spent a long time thinking about Gorgias. I myself did. Um, and what the force, say, for example, of his encomium of Helen, or the proof that nothing, that everything is nothing, or that nothing exists, what exactly they were supposed to be doing. And on the one hand, the 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 encomium on Helen was, I think, supposed to be doing two things. One, it was supposed to be in some ways being a bit of advertising for him. But I think that the second part of it was that it was an announcement that the training that becoming wise was a training that released you from a long tradition of not thinking hard about things. And now again, I think that the divide between philosophy and rhetoric is maybe overstated. Again, an inheritance of Plato. But one of the things that we see from Gorgias is that if he's right, again, I'm not inclined to think that he's right, but if he's right, there's something about the long-standing and thoughtless tradition of blaming Helen. Think deeply about that. And I think that there's something about, again, there's, you might say, the cynical interpretation of Gorgias, which is, hey, look at how sharp and innovative these strategies are. And look at how rhetoric can carry you away and you learn these strategies and you can, right, you can manipulate people in the same way that Helen was manipulated. That's the cynical interpretation. And that's Plato's interpretation. That in some ways, what rhetoric does is makes this promise of being able to elicit assent and to be able to then subvert so much. And in fact, Plato even saw the subversion that came about from saying, look at what we have been assuming about Helen here, and we just needed to think about it. But that second part, where we think hard about Helen, and we think hard about the position that she was put in if she was really convinced, doing what's right by her own life. Like that's what the being convinced by Logos ultimately is. If that's the case, then mitigating our blame for Helen is something that looks like is required, and in fact is a way of breaking from a thoughtless tradition. That in fact, that's what it is to be wise. That's what it is to be a grown-up. That's what it is to actually be somebody who thinks hard and can see things about people. And so, look, I think that there's something deep about the encomium on Helen, and I think that it is there's a cynical version to it, and I think that that's the most overwhelmingly taught one. But I think that there's a kind of a deeper version that Gorgias has got there, where he's saying, look, we live in the society that where things are just treated like they're obvious and they're not. That we can kind of crack them open and think harder about them. Does that make him more like a philosopher? Yeah, I'm a philosopher, and so it's like, look, I'm gonna give Gorgias as much credit as I can if I'm going to criticize him. But there's something about that seems right, and I think that the same thing goes with Protagoras. I think that the same thing goes with regards to Cicero. I think that Cicero's account of rhetoric is one that connects up with his academic skeptical program. that so much of the ways in which one makes the best case is in terms of being able to lay out how the reasons connect with each other. That's an academic philosophical story. Cicero on rhetoric is in fact what a philosopher should say about rhetoric. So the divide between rhetoric and philosophy, I don't think is as wide as we might have inherited, and so many practitioners use. I myself say nasty things about rhetoric and rhetoricians and things like that. I've done it in print and called rhetoric uh, um, rabble rousing and troublemaking and making oneself a nuisance or something like that. But I actually don't believe that. That's just me being a philosopher and being a jerk. I actually think the rhetorical tradition is a tradition that, again, has been portrayed in a certain way by Plato, but it's one that actually is a kind of just like with the philosophical tradition, one that shows a kind of a break with thoughtless traditionalism.
Yeah, I agree that there is that the divide is can oftentimes be overstated. I think being trained in English and philosophy, my English was very heavy on rhetoric. My thing was argumentation theory, unsurprisingly. Um, I think there is a strong sociological divide and maybe pedagogical divide between philosophy and rhetoric, but I think theoretically they're much closer than a lot of people think. Um,
Yeah, Christopher Tyndale has got a great book, Reason's Dark Champions.
yes, I
On
want to read that. I have that saved.
okay, Chris is such a great writer and he's a deep thinker and somebody who is in a philosophy department, but also somebody who defends the rhetorical theory of argument. And so it's rhetoric, argumentation, and philosophy all there together with in Chris's head. And it's a really compelling story. It's one that in some ways was part of what brought me a little bit closer to that tradition. I myself 10 years ago was stamped with Plato's stamp about rhetoric. Um, I've wriggled free of that thanks to Chris.
As a half rhetorician, I'm happy to hear that. Okay, I got some rapid fire questions to conclude the
Okay.
interview. Okay,
Hopefully rapid fire answers. We'll see how I do.
okay, yeah. Okay, other than Why We Argue, which everyone should purchase and read, where would you recommend people new to argumentation theory go to introduce themselves?
Hmm. Well, I think that Douglas Walton's Informal Logic is a classic in the area. It was published by Cambridge University Press back in 1989. Came out with a second edition, or I want to say 2010. I can't remember exactly. That is uh, 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 maybe the sort of a kind of a Bible of the pragmatic program. Um, I would be inclined to say uh, Van Imeren and Grutendorst's I can't remember the title of it. It was like I want to say Fundamentals of Argumentation Theory or
Yeah, I
something
got it
like
right
that. If you
here.
got a copy of it there, it's not coming back to me. My Zotero remembers the title of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
2004 Cambridge University Press. Um, that I think is a great place to start. So those two books would be the sort of the two main places. Strangely enough, I think that both of those are really on the kind of the more pragmatic side. Um, there's one other feature to argumentation theory that I think is maybe underestimated, which is the epistemic background to
Mhm.
what we're trying to achieve with argumentation. What we're trying to do is display our knowledge and display our understanding. And so Harvey Siegel's Understanding Reason is another place that again is a case where argumentation theory, and in this case, education is connected. That Harvey's view is that to really have taught something and to have learned something is to be able to explain it and to argue about it.
Nice. I'm excited to read those. Okay. I'm wondering if there's one argumentation scholar you think other people should read. It could be somebody that doesn't get a lot of attention, somebody that has gotten a lot of attention. Could be somebody you already
Um,
know.
so I think that there are two. I think that Lillian Bermejo Luque, She has a really interesting approach to argumentation theory. She's got a number of articles committed to this, which is that, again, this procedural notion of argument, but that we're also arguing about each other's reasons. That this dialectical feature of our reasoning is really important, that we need to not just be thinking about the things, but we need to be thinking about each other and triangulating with each other as we're thinking about the things on which we're agreeing and disagreeing. I think that the other person to think hard about and to be aware of is David Godin's work. David is somebody who thinks hard about the fallacies. He's somebody who thinks hard about reasons why we would come to argue. And the core of David's work is, again, what we're doing whenever we're arguing is that we're trying to find decision procedures that are going to be acceptable to us and stable past our disagreements. So, and David thinks that in this regard, we need to be thinking about ourselves and the selves that are going to be in the future on the basis of these arguments, that we're in some ways crafting a self in the future that's going to live by what we've agreed on or disagreed on in these arguments. So I think that those are two, Lillian and David.
Nice. Okay, final question. You're going into a debate against Cicero concerning some unknown political issue that you're reasonably informed about. You can bring one person with you, alive or dead, as your co-debater. Who's it going to be?
Well, unfortunately, you took my first choice away from me
Yeah.
and being my opponent. Cicero is, in fact, my number one intellectual hero, and so I'm a little bit worried about how we're going to do, no matter who I bring in. In this regard, I would say, well, maybe bring Protagoras with me. Protagoras and I hopefully would be able to think of both the pros and the cons to both sides of these arguments and be able to anticipate what Cicero's arguments are going to be, because that's Protagoras's training. And so between the two of us, we should be able to anticipate most of Cicero's moves before we go in. So I think that I might rely on my pal Protagoras to be able to train us up to be able to
Okay.
think about both sides.
Okay, thanks for joining us today.
Ian, it was a pleasure to talk with you. Thanks for the questions.